Welcome into Wrestling Spotlight here on True TV Plus, on Carbon TV, on Watching on Sports.tv, coming to you across the country, your 24/7 home for professional wrestling. And we have a special guest today, Gerald Bentley here, joined by Sonny the Man Eagle Cain, our pro wrestling veteran correspondent, and we have the author of the soon-to-be release, coming out June 24th, available for pre-order now on Amazon, wherever you get your books. Say hello to the bad guys. Yo, Marc Raimondi is joining us here, and he has a book coming out that I think really does not just show how the New World Order changed America, but how it reverberated and really changed pro wrestling as we know it still to this day. Marc, great topic. And man, just seeing the book cover when I reached out to you, I was thinking back to those WCW Monday Nitros when the Outsiders first debuted, and what a difference it was. What made you want to do this book, and how did you get involved in it?
Wow, so that's actually a really interesting story. So it actually was not initially my idea. So my regular job is I work for ESPN, and now I
Okay.
cover the NFL. I cover the Atlanta Falcons. I live in Atlanta,
Hmm.
but before I covered the Atlanta Falcons, I covered combat sports. So it was mostly the UFC. I did that for 11 years. I did that. I covered the UFC primarily, but also a little bit of boxing, a little bit of pro wrestling. So in 2019, the NWO was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I was assigned that story by my editor at ESPN, to write for ESPN.com.
Mm-hmm.
So WWE hooked me up with interviews with Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan. And then I wrote the article. And I didn't just write a quick 500 word, news story, keep it simple. I went overboard. I completely overwrote the story because I'm a lifelong wrestling fan, and I was 11 years old when the NWO started, when Hollywood Hogan turned heel, and that was a
Mm-hmm.
formative memory and an influential time in my life, that I remember vividly. So I overwrote this story, guys. Like I probably wrote like 2,000 words. It could have been 500, and I wrote more than double that. And it meant something to me, and I put kind of my
Mm-hmm.
heart into it, and I put like how much the NWO influenced wrestling, like you said at the top, Gerald. And wrote the story, it published, and then I kind of went about my life. And then about a year and a half later, I get an email, and I'm sitting in a hotel room in Houston, Texas, and it's a UFC fight week, so I'm there to cover a UFC event, and I get an
Mm-hmm.
email from someone who says they are an editor at Simon and Schuster, the publishing company, right? One of the biggest in the world.
Sure.
And this person who says they're an editor is asking me if I want to write a book about the NWO. It turns out that they saw my article about the NWO going into the Hall of Fame, and they thought, they wanted to do a book about the NWO, and they said, okay, this is the guy that has to write it because he overwrote this story, right?
Yeah.
He really put some heart and soul into it. And to be honest with you guys, I really thought like it was fake. I didn't think this was a real email. I thought it was like I was getting scammed. I thought maybe like a
Sure.
Nigerian prince was trying to get my money or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what I thought, but I
Prince
just knew
Nana
that
was
I
reaching
was.
out to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in a hotel room. I'm covering the UFC that week, and I get this email. But after googling and seeing if this was a real person, turns out that it was. And we spoke on the phone that day, and really immediately we hit it off. And he was also a wrestling fan like me during that same
Mm-hmm.
time period, and the NWO meant a great deal to him as it did to me. And really, in our first conversation, we kind of like found kindred spirits a little bit as to what we thought wrestling was and how much it's influenced things in the country and how much the NWO was a catalyst for that. So that's what started the whole process, was this cold email from Simon and Schuster. And I'm really grateful because ESPN afforded me an outlet to write about wrestling, and I did write
Mm-hmm.
about wrestling for years at ESPN. I wrote a couple of quite a few stories that I'm pretty proud of, and now I'm writing a book about the NWO. I mean, if 11-year-old Marc knew this would become the future for him. I mean, just kind of awesome, just kind of like I
Yeah.
get emotional kind of thinking about it because as a kid, like wrestling was like my obsession. I was just completely immersed in wrestling. So that's how it all happened. And then that was in 2021, guys. And, now 4 years later, it's almost a reality. Like I actually just got the box of books from Simon and Schuster yesterday at my home
Awesome.
here in Atlanta. And it was just crazy to open up the box and, pick it up and, touch it and like,
Sure.
hope like this is like, I don't know if I can curse on here, but man, it's a crazy feeling.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think that resonates with people too. I mean, like I'm amazed that I'm doing wrestling talk and
Hmm.
we have a 24/7 wrestling channel that's on 10 different streaming platforms and going to events, going to WrestleMania because, you know, when I was a high school athlete, I was watching WCW and watching Raw. And my friends at school who were into pro wrestling were saying, well, how can you watch WCW? That sucks. Uh, it's not the WWE. And then instantly, when Hall and Nash came out there,
Yep. Things
you could
changed.
feel the difference. I mean,
Hmm.
Sonny, you were there. You were in the Crockett promotion territory area, and WCW country. What was the feeling to the workers when they came in? Because there was an element of reality to the outsiders coming in and taking over, wasn't there?
Yes, sir. A lot of the workers were resentful that they had come in and single-handedly destroyed WCW at that point with Hulk Hogan. They weren't sure the future of the company back then. As I've said so many times before on this program, we didn't have all these areas to wrestle out of like now TNA, Next, AEW, Ring of Honor. We didn't have all those places. We had three places. We had ECW, we had WCW, and we had WWE. And you didn't have a WWE draft. WWE literally approached you as they did me if you got lucky enough to be approached. So when the outsiders came in, people were like, "What in the world's going on? Is this a true takeover, or is this just a stunt per se?" And as the weeks unfolded, it became more clear. It became clear that it was a natural takeover, and that this was a new direction that things were going into. And my understanding of things back in the day was Hogan had a great deal to do with that, and he and Bischoff got together and collaborated on the takeover and how things were going to go. And as I've read later, Flair felt betrayed because they didn't cue him in to the ongoings of the actual takeover after all the years he'd been there, and that was part of the reason. My understanding is that Flair left the WCW finally and went on to the WWF because of his unlikely involvement with Eric Bischoff
Yeah.
over
And
business matters.
what's crazy, Mark, we're you can still on a wrestling if we had wrestling talk radio going here, I could open up the phone lines and say, hey, fill up the phone lines. Let's talk
Oh yeah.
about 83 weeks and the NWO. And the lines would light up. It was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
How was it that impactful? I mean, you spent obviously years digging into it.
Yeah.
What was it that Hall and Nash coming in and then Hogan joining just utterly changed the face of pro wrestling?
It was a whole different vibe than what was going on in the early to mid 90s at that point. And what I mean by that is the WWF was struggling. The steroid trial had just finished up in 93, 94, and they had taken a big PR hit, a big reputation hit, and they had also taken a financial hit because they spent a lot of money financing that trial, against the feds, which
Yeah.
is not an easy thing to do. So they were kind of struggling financially. The business was down. Hogan and Savage left to go to WCW. Now, they were past their prime. and Vince was okay with them moving on because he felt he was already kind of going in a different direction with the Bret Harts and the Shawn Michaels and the Undertakers and guys like that. He was kind of going in like, remember the new generation, that whole deal. He was trying to get younger,
Sure.
trying to get, guys that didn't look like they were juiced up on steroids because after the reputation hit of the trial. So Hogan and Macho Man go over to WCW, and it does immediately help WCW's business. But WCW was always considered a second-rate promotion compared to WWF, as you were saying before, Gerald. To the
Mhm.
outsiders, but and also to people in the business, it was always felt like it was not on a level of the WWF as far as popularity, money, production value. Right? Just the show didn't look as good.
Sure.
So as much as Hogan and Savage helped, they didn't help to the extent where they were gonna beat the WWF anytime soon, right? The business went up, but not a great deal. And pretty soon after Hogan arrived, business kind of started to plateau, and it was hot, initially, and then he had a program with Vader in '95 that really didn't do big business, and he was starting to get a little bit of a booze, right? Hulkamania
Mhm.
had kind of become passe, right? It was not what people wanted in 1995, 96. And then Scott Hall was really the first one, I think, to me, to that changed everything because he took the risk of leaving the WWF in his prime, where he was still getting pushed as a top guy, and he went over to WCW because he wanted a better schedule and he wanted more money. That frankly, that was it. And
Yeah.
he took that risk, and then Nash followed with him. Decided really a few months later that he was also going to go with Hall, and when they came to WCW, it was just a paradigm shift of what was happening in the wrestling business because no one had ever really left Vince at that time. It's still in their primes. And what Bischoff wanted to do was he wanted to get WCW to feel a little bit more real and authentic and I mean legitimate to an extent,
Authentic.
but obviously it's still wrestling, right? And that started in the Nitro era. When Nitro started, Lex Luger showed up as a surprise. The first episode of Nitro, he's giving away the results of Raw on Nitro. The live Nitro
Mhm.
when Raw is taped. He's giving away the results. Medusa comes back from WWF with the WWF Women's Title and throws it in the trash. These are the kind of
Yeah.
things that Bischoff was trying to
I
add to
remember that.
WCW, and he was trying to like reshape WCW's personality almost in his own image because he was kind of like a brash, arrogant, cocky guy. He was young. He was in his late 30s, early
Mhm.
40s, and he was trying to remold what WCW was into his own image. And I'm sure Sonny can back me up. Like WCW was still very much. It felt still very much at that time in the early '90s as like an extension of Georgia Championship Wrestling or as an extension of Crockett. It was still very almost like it's still a territory, but it was
Right.
it was a national promotion, but it was still kind of a territory. And when Hall and Nash came over, I think it changed so many things because Bischoff was already kind of building the foundation of this kind of like brash, irreverent wrestling promotion, and Hall and Nash coming in with the idea that Bischoff had to debut them as kind of an invasion kind of blew everyone's minds because no one had ever really seen that before at that level in wrestling. And it was something that Bischoff took inspiration from Japan because he was going to Japan a lot and because of the relationship between WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling. So he was going there and he saw how the Japanese were treating wrestling with more respect than we were treating it here in the States. People would go to the shows wearing suits and ties, and it was treated
Sure.
more like a legitimate sport. And he wanted to bring
Right.
that over, and at that time period, there was also an invasion storyline where a promotion called UWFI in Japan invaded New Japan Pro Wrestling. So certainly there was elements of that he borrowed. Right, wrestling is always derivative. Right, there's always things that people borrow from the past. Nothing wrong with
Oh,
that.
yeah. Nothing's
So he,
new.
he kind of he kind of took he kind of took that idea from Japan, mixed it with his own kind of personality and feeling of like this brash, irreverent promotion, and put it together. Hall and Nash being the centerpieces of that in the NWO, and then you add Hollywood Hogan. You add Hulk Hogan turning heel for the first time in over a decade after being the biggest star in the history of pro wrestling, and you
Right.
have, you know, it's like a chemistry experiment, right? You add all the ingredients together, guys, and it explodes, and it gets massive.
Yeah, and I've heard, and there's been plenty of documentaries, that they were so concerned that Hulk may change his mind because he was worried
Yep.
about outside endorsement deals, that they had him sequestered all day and had Kevin Sullivan, the
That's correct.
taskmaster, kind of babysitting him to make sure, hey, you make it in.
Yep.
Was
Yeah,
Hogan
Kevin Sullivan had a
involved the whole
condo.
time? Yeah.
What was that? Sorry, I missed that.
Was Hogan involved the whole time, or was it an addition after they realized what they had going with Hall and Nash?
Okay, so at that time, Hogan was away from WCW because he was filming a movie in LA. And so they had no plans to actually bring Hogan back at that point in time. They were going to bring Hogan back in like October, November of '96, and he was probably going to feud with whatever this group was going to end up being, Hall and Nash and whoever the third guy was. It was initially going to be Sting. That was the initial plan from Bischoff, because he thought that it would be first of all, you know, Sting's character, kind of like Hogan, was stuck like in the late '80s, early '90s. It was no longer getting the reaction that it used to. Like that colorful face paint and the blonde hair just wasn't, you know, it wasn't of the time in the mid '90s as it was a few years prior. So, you know, he felt like Sting was kind of ready to make a change, and he thought that Sting was always the franchise babyface of WCW. No one had ever seen him as a heel, so he thought that it would make a big impact. Hey, Sting for the first time turns heel, joins Hall and Nash. He's almost like the inside man of this invasion. That was the original idea. And that's what they were going forward with until Hulk Hogan called Bischoff right around Great American Bash '96. Hogan called Bischoff, and basically what was happening is that every Tuesday morning, Jimmy Hart would FedEx Nitro, a VHS tape of Nitro, to Hogan in LA. So he was watching it. He was, even though he was doing the movie, he was still watching Nitro, and he took interest in what was going on with Hall and Nash. So he calls Bischoff. Bischoff flies to LA, you know, flies into LA, goes up to Calabasas, like in the mountains, like above LA there, and meets Hogan in his trailer. And basically, what happened was there was no small talk. It was like Bischoff sits down, they crack open a beer, and Hogan is like, "So who's the third man?" And Bischoff is like, Bischoff doesn't know what to say because he's afraid if he says it's going to be Sting, then Hogan might tell his buddy, and then his buddy tells somebody else, and then all of a sudden it gets all over the place and it's in the dirt sheets, right? Meltzer has it and whoever, right?
Right.
So Bischoff answers him. He says, "Who do you think it should be?" And Hogan just sits there and kind of, you know, does one of these with his Fu Manchu and goes, "You're looking at him, brother." And that was it. And that was it. And Bischoff, like, it blew Bischoff's mind. It was like, okay, this is actually a much better idea. But he didn't know that Hogan would actually go for it. But Hogan saw how good the Hall and Nash debut was, and the subsequent weeks of those guys, and how compelling television was, and he knew right away, knowing it, you know, because of how savvy he was about what fans wanted and what worked in wrestling. He's a genius when it comes to that stuff. So he saw like, okay, you add me to this mix, forget it. And that's how it all came together.
Yeah, and it was great great timing too, because like you said, the Hulkster, you know, the big leg drop, that it kind of run its course because people are looking for the more athletic style of wrestling, more like the Japanese style, honestly.
Yep.
And Sting as the surfer, I mean, it rejuvenated his career too. I mean, my God, I was at WrestleCon just a month ago now in Las Vegas, and they had to move Sting to a different wing of the Westgate Casino, which, if you haven't been there, it's a big convention center. But the line for Sting was so huge, he was blocking out everyone else. So they put him in one of the restaurants that doesn't open up until 4 o'clock, so the people could line up in the hallway and everybody else could get their chance to get autographs. And it was like 400 people waiting in line for Sting. And then I was up there talking to Rhino and Ricky
Mhm.
Morton and Rob Van Dam, who's from Las Vegas, and
Mhm.
nobody. So the impact was just so amazing because the
Yep.
Crow character of Sting, that just lit everything up. Do you get into that in the book too? How they decided to make the move with Sting?
Yes, yes. So Sting had agreed to be the third man. So Sting was going to turn heel, and he was pretty excited about it. And you know, he thought that was going to rejuvenate his career. And Eric Bischoff had to kind of break it to him that, hey, it's gonna be Hogan, but we still need you as a backup because, as we talked about before, they were not sure that
Mhm.
Hogan was actually going to do it until he was actually at the Ocean Center in Daytona that night at Bash at the Beach. So
Mm.
Sting was kind of in at that point he was kind of in flux, I guess, right? His character, like, you know, he wanted to change, but he didn't really know what to do. Like, and then one day in the fall or maybe even the late summer of that year, '96, you know, he's there in you know, backstage before the show and he's putting on his face paint. And he's in a room with, like, you know, Luger and Bischoff and Hall and Nash. And Hall goes over to him. He's like, "You ever seen the movie The Crow?" And Sting is like, "No, no, I've never seen it." He's like, "You should do your face paint just like the Crow does it, the white face paint with, like, you know, the black streaks." And and Hall tells him, "And you should model your character, like, have it be spooky like the Undertaker, you know, kind of steal a little bit from the Undertaker's, you know, his
Uh-huh.
aura." And that's how it kind of happened. And Sting, you know, the way that Bischoff told me the story for the book is like, Sting is a very analytical guy, and he does not like. He takes a long time to process certain things, you know, like information. If people pitch him an idea, he doesn't say yes right away. But when this happened, when Hall gave him that idea, he was just all in on it. He was just like, "All right, this is exactly what I have to do." And actually, one of my favorite parts of the book, and I'm not sure, Ellis Edwards was the coordinator of WCW, and he was the guy responsible for all the times Sting rappelled down from the ceiling or from a helicopter. That one time at Club La Villa,
Yeah.
and you know, I sat down with Ellis Edwards for hours, and I don't know if he's done many interviews ever, but he talked to me for hours, and I have some, like, really great details about, you know, Sting during that time being up in the rafters, the rappelling down, what they had to do, like how it all worked, the process of how they got him to rappel down safely. Really fascinating stuff. And some of my favorite parts of the book is like, I just thought Ellis Edwards was so good at his job that after WCW ended, Vince McMahon hired him, and he was in WWE for another, like, you know, 15 years, 30, 20 years after that. He just retired actually recently. So
Huh.
really interesting guy, and a lot of cool, different, unique details from that time.
Yeah, just the whole era. And then I mean, Sonny, I know we've talked about the cultural influence of pro wrestling. I mean, it's not coincidental that Captain America, the latest Captain America, was originally going to be called New World Order. I mean, you still see NWO shirts everywhere. And they're not old NWO shirts, they're new ones. It's
Hmm.
still one of the best selling shirts on WWE Shop.
Yep.
And I think the whole, like you said, the paradigm shift,
Hmm.
that was really the beginning of making the cool heel the popular wrestler. Because
Yes.
Ric Flair had his popularity. I mean, he did. He was neat. I mean, he was just a out front personality, larger than life. And he'd have his, you know, great matches. A lot of people still say he's the best technical wrestler ever. But Hall and Nash, and then carrying on Hogan, it was different.
Hmm.
I mean, it
Hmm.
was, hey, we're against these guys, and people loved it. And you still see it to today. I mean, how much did the NWO give birth to the voice of the voiceless, the Second City Saint, CM
Hmm.
Punk? I mean, it's
Yeah,
just, it still
even like,
reverberates.
I would even argue, like, in pop culture, right before the mid '90s, there weren't as many. I mean, you can kind of dial it back to the early '90s a little bit, but like, think about the '80s and what like pop culture was and what the movies were. It was, you know, it was Stallone and Schwarzenegger and Rambo, you know, Rocky, the,
Hmm.
you know, all the Arnold movies, and it was like these big epic, heroes and these epic stories, and the good guy wins in the end. And then the 90s, things get very different in the country, and there is that and there's a lot of reasons for it, that I write about in the book. The economic reasons, and everything is changing. There was some violence in the 90s. We were at war, right? There was the Oklahoma City bombing. There was the World Trade Center got bombed in the early 90s, and we were just as a society, we were feeling a lot different about everything than we were in the 80s. And the NWO was a kind of rode that wave in a sense, because all of a sudden you have movies like Goodfellas, about villains. You have and then you have the era of the NWO, where it's like these guys they're the bad guys, right? Say hello to the bad guys. That's the book title.
Yeah.
But you want them to win. They're the most fascinating thing, even though they're bad. You still have like for whatever reason, you feel kind of like an affection for the bad guys. And that all really started, I think, in this country in the 90s. And then after that, you get like The Sopranos, and you get Breaking Bad, and like almost all storytelling now is like based around the anti-hero or the bad guy. And that really started in the NWO era. And I'm not saying that Eric Bischoff, was the one who kicked that off, but certainly he rode that wave. And sometimes set the pace of what that was going to be. And the NWO was beloved because they were bad, but they did it in a cool, interesting, charismatic way. And that was, to me, a really, really big thing in the middle of the 90s that carried over into the Stone Cold, into the Rock, to DX, and so on and so forth. And, NWO, if that doesn't happen and doesn't get as big, does the Attitude Era happen, right? Does Vince have to change to change his product to catch up with WCW again? And if that doesn't happen, then is there a Stone Cold that gets as big? Is The Rock as big? Is The Rock the biggest star in Hollywood right now? I mean, there's so much domino effect that started, I think, with the NWO. And that, to me, Gerald and Sonny, is why it's so relevant today, because that really was like a formative, like, storyline, time period. Everything clicked.
Yeah.
Everything clicked. It was so of the time, and people remember it for being just like cool and different and just very 90s. But look, everything else comes back in style, right? I see kids today, they're wearing the same stuff that me and my friends were wearing in like 2001. Like, what is going on here? And that's true. Everything kind of repeats itself. And I think the NWO is something that's going to last for life, right? That's what they say. That's the slogan, for life.
Well, and I think we're still seeing it too, because I mean, Sonny, we had a chance to just see Seth freaking Rollins, Braun Breaker, Bronson Reed. They got the third man.
Yep.
And they're gonna run Monday Night Raw. I mean, that's an invasion story, except he's doing it from the inside.
Yep.
The Bloodline, Roman Reigns. I mean, you keep seeing it, and I really agree with that, Mark. Because Sonny, do you think, if having been active in the ring at this time, if WCW, with Ted Turner's money and Eric Bischoff and the Hulkster running the ship, beating WWE, do we see the reinvigoration of WWE getting to the point where they were able to buy out WCW and shut it down? Or would it have just been status quo and it would have just kept running until WCW eventually shut down?
It may would have kept running until WCW eventually shut down. The buyout came.
Or maybe they win.
Yeah, the buyout came before they ran the whole deal to the level that they wanted to in WCW. But I never understood, even when I was in the business, why WCW was paying everybody the fees that they were, the amounts that they were paying them, because they weren't putting it back into the business properly the way they should have to have kept everybody employed on a permanent level. And that's when a lot of the guys began calling WWF back and saying, hey, can we come back over? And that's when Vince Vince McMahon looked and said, "Hey, do y'all want to do a buyout?" And everybody was shocked when the buyout came and happened. So, and that cut me up a little bit at that time too, because it meant I had to go further away to work because Vince McMahon bought up, as I said previously on this show, all the little leagues, Mark, and on the territories and the independents, and everything shut down for about 5 to 10 years. I mean, it just dried up, and there was some resentment among the fellas because it was career ending for them at that point in time. And this happened badly around 2002 when I finally retired. And unless you wanted to go Gerald states away, had a chance to make $50 to $100 a match, you weren't going to keep going. So it wasn't a good deal for everybody. And what Vince had promised was, and it never came to a reality, Mark, was he was going to reinvent WCW and ECW and have 3 different mega shows on. And once he bought out WCW and ECW, that never transpired again, aside from a pop-up show of ECW about once every 5-6 years. And I never understood that. So it wasn't the money-making wheel that it had been during my earlier days on the road when it was territorial like it's gone back to now. The territories is what keeps the major leagues going because they have fresh talent. You pull from them. You get the fresh guys in there. You get the fresh storylines in there. It just keeps the wheel turning. So, it was disastrous for guys like me.
Well,
caught in the middle.
If we look back, no, that's great, Sonny. And if we look back, Mark, was it just a case that WCW just kind of stumbled in? I mean, Bischoff had a plan, but it just stumbled in and it burned hotter than they thought it would. And there just
100%.
wasn't enough of a foundation underneath to keep it going.
100%. Yeah. So it was, no one really thought that it was going to take off the way that it ended up taking off. I mean, no one, not Hall, not Nash, not Bischoff. I mean, they knew that it was going to be a good storyline, but, become something that we're talking about because I wrote a book about it, 29 years later. Certainly no one at that time had any clue. I remember I interviewed Dave Meltzer for this book, and he told me a good story. He saw Bischoff right at the beginning of the NWO storyline in like May or June '96, and he saw him at the remember that big show that I think it was like AAA, New Japan, and WCW all did in LA. I think it was a Peace Festival. I think it was like an Inoki thing, and he saw Bischoff at this big show in LA. And he told Bischoff, like, this is, by the way, I know they don't like each other now, but they were actually pretty friendly back then, Bischoff and Meltzer. And Meltzer told Bischoff, like, hey, you got a great storyline going with these, Hall and Nash, these guys coming over. And Bischoff was like, I think I can keep it going until December of this year. And Meltzer's like, December of this year? You can keep it going until December of next year if you play it right. So they didn't have any idea at that time, like, how big this was going to be. No one did. Marketing, the marketing department in WCW didn't know anything about this storyline until Hogan turned heel and said the words New World Order at Bash at the Beach. They had no clue. There was no plan. They didn't have anything. They didn't have music. They didn't have a logo. They had nothing until they had to be very reactive instead of proactive because no one knew that it was going to take off the way it did. And by the way, WCW barely had any, their merchandise in there, and that all their ancillary stuff was nowhere near what WWF had, right? As far as like the production, the marketing, and they had to really get up to speed quick to accommodate the popularity of the NWO, and they did it. But yes, it's one of those things where Bischoff had the idea, but he only had really a few months of storyline ideas, and they had to kind of take it from there. And things got so difficult to, like, because Hogan has creative control and he's able to change match finishes and he's able to change, he doesn't want to do this, he doesn't want to do that, he doesn't want this guy to do that, he doesn't want this guy to do this. And then, Nash gets a little bit of creative control in late 98, early 99. And it was just very tough to like keep the creativity flowing. Hall and Nash they were furious when Bischoff fired Sean Waltman, their friend. And that's kind of when
Not friend.
they kind of stopped. Yeah, your buddy Sonny,
Yeah.
Sean, who was tremendous to talk to, by the way, just a tremendous guy. But when he got fired, Hall and Nash kind of shut down as far as adding creative ideas, because they were a big part of, they weren't the booking team, but like Hall giving Sting that idea about the Crow. They were very useful when it came to that type of stuff. And when Waltman got fired, they stopped, and that was 90. And 98, middle 98, Waltman gets fired. Hall has to go to rehab. Nash and Hogan hate each other at that point. They want to kill each other. So that kind of led to the Wolfpack splitting off into another NWO, because it was almost done because of backstage politics as much as anything else. But it worked, right? Because the Wolfpack became extremely popular. But you guys know wrestling, right? When you have NWO Hollywood, Hogan's NWO, against Kevin Nash's Wolfpack, what is the natural progression for a storyline? What match has to happen when it's the Hollywood NWO versus Kevin Nash's NWO? Hogan versus Nash, right?
Hogan.
Never happened, because they could never get there. They could never get together and come up with a finish that both of them were okay with, until the finger poke of doom in early 99, which was kind of a death knell for the NWO and for WCW, I would argue. So there were all those political machinations going on, and a lot of it was really just Hall and Nash felt like the NWO was theirs. They were the ones that brought the cool factor and the charisma. They were younger. They had kind of like they were the ones listening to hip hop and bringing some of the hip hop references and the urban references into the NWO. Whereas Hogan was still, old school, but he felt like, hey, the NWO doesn't exist unless I turn heel. I'm the biggest star in the history of wrestling. And I turned heel, and I made this group to what it was. And the truth is that it doesn't happen without all of them. There's no NWO the way that we know it without all of them contributing to an extent. But at that time, 2 years into the storyline or whatever, they're kind of at each other's throats and nothing is getting done creatively. Bret Hart is there, coming off the Montreal Screwjob, and he's the biggest babyface in the industry, and they have no idea what to do with them. And it's not even so much that they don't know, it's that the egos and the politics got in the way of him doing anything in WCW of note, which is just mind-blowing. Because how do you not do Hogan versus Bret Hart? At some point, Hogan as a heel against Bret Hart as a babyface. You're printing money with all these storylines, and they just can never get them to go together for whatever reason. And luckily they had Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone come in. They did big business with that. They did big business with Jay Leno. But then you go right into like Hogan trying to bring the Warrior back and do that storyline again from 1990, and it's like, man, this has kind of jumped the shark now. We're not, 96 and 97, the heyday of the NWO is long gone. Now we're kind of like, we're kind of getting table scraps of what the original storyline was supposed to be.
Well, the Warrior promo that may have been the jump the shark moment too.
The Warrior, like
so many like a minute and went 10 minutes.
Yeah, so many producers and like PAs told me that I interviewed, they were like, they could not stand working with Warrior because he just didn't listen. He missed all of his cues. He went over every promo and he just didn't care. And he was just an asshole. Excuse my language. Yeah. And no one liked him backstage at WCW. A few of the guys, the workers, they thought he was okay. But the people who worked like behind the scenes, the producers, the production assistants, people like that, directors, they could not stand the guy.
It's crazy that he and Sting came up together because
I know
the stories between the two are just so different.
Completely.
Sonny, any as we're kind of winding down here, any NWO memories that really jump out for you? Do you have an NWO fond memory question? Anything coming up?
Just my deal with Sean. He on the very last show that he and I were on at the Mid-Atlantic, he said he was going to try and push himself further and harder than he had been, and I'd be seeing them again, and that's the way we kind of left it because we crisscrossed each other so often on the road that we just took for granted, like having a coat off of Jimmy Bryant way back in the day, sort of, that we'd be seeing each other again. And he went up north, and that was the last I saw of him until on Twitter a few years ago when I saw his account up there. But the NWO was so hated when it came out. I'm on the Bible Belt in North Carolina. That church people hated the NWO.
Yeah.
And they went all biblical about it, and I said, guys, I think you're going way overboard with it, but anyway, I don't think that's what they had intended for it to imply. And how could I be a part of something like that? This, that, that. I said, well, I'm not an NWO, I'm a paid worker. So try explaining that to a fan. But anyway, it'll make you squirrely.
You're really right on though, Sonny, because there was like and you mentioned Flair earlier too.
Mhm.
It was very much like, yes, it was a storyline, but there was a lot of resentment against Hall and Nash and Waltman and those guys because they really thumbed their nose at the old school wrestlers, at the Flairs, at the Pipers, at the Arn Andersons. There was remember that like satirical thing they did, like where they dressed up like the Horsemen, and Nash brought out Arn's cooler, and man, that really got under their skin, and they really the old school guys from the territory days, they really did not like Hall and Nash and those folks. They really didn't. And to this day, Ric Flair hates Sean Waltman. Hates him. He hates Sean Waltman. He really does. And Sean Waltman does not like Ric Flair very much. But they had that program together in '98, and man, that was like real. Like they were cutting shoe promos on each other. Like one time, Waltman slapped Flair as hard as he could, in the ring. It got real nasty, and there was a fight between Nash and Piper too at one point. It's all in the book. But it's true though. What Sonny is saying is very true. Is that it was a storyline, but the guys in the South, who were there, who worked there in the '70s and the '80s, and into the early '90s, there was a lot of resentment against Hall and Nash. They were coming from New York, and they were they weren't the nicest guys in the world. They were these arrogant, assholes who came from New York, and they were great at what they did. But they pissed people off. They pissed off the Nasty Boys. They pissed a lot of people off, and it was a very volatile time in WCW backstage too, because they were not well liked backstage.
I can imagine. I'm sure it's
I believe that.
a great read, and I'm sure we just kind of scratched the surface because it had to be a crazy 83-week stretch. And after the NWO was done, WCW creeped on for a couple of years, but that was it. I mean, it never came back.
It never came back, and they tried to kind of like resuscitate the NWO a couple more times, but it never really worked. And at that point, it was like they bring in Vince Russo, and things were changing, and it just never really came together for them creatively. And you could really tell, because I went back and I watched over 500 hours of WCW, from '96 through '99, and man, I have to tell you, '97 watching that was incredible. It was beautiful, guys. Like the '90s, everything made sense. The storylines were coherent. They were building to things. You could really get a sense of a plan and of like what they had. A structure, and the characters were great. Guys were willing to put people over. Macho Man was putting over DDP. He really made DDP in '97. I feel like I don't think DDP would have been as popular if not for that Macho Man program in '97. And '97 was just an incredible year of wrestling in WCW. I enjoyed watching that so much. And then '98 happened. And let me tell you, it kind of went downhill. As fun as the Wolfpack stuff was, You know, Bret Hart is there doing nothing. Then you turn Bret Hart heel. He kind of joins the NWO, but he doesn't. He's not wearing the shirt, but he's an associate. I asked Bret, and I interviewed him, and he was fantastic. I asked him, "Were you ever actually a member of the NWO?" And he was like, "I don't even know." He's like, "I don't even know," because the creative was such a mess at that time. It was and a lot of it was just politics, and guys just didn't know. You just couldn't get anything done, and Bischoff was burnt out because of the lawsuit that was going on between WWF and WCW, and the merger that was happening with Time Warner and AOL and Turner. So he was like in all these board meetings, and he doesn't have time to or the energy anymore to like put together good creative ideas. So he's just kind of like giving the thumbs up. Okay, yeah, sure. You know, Terry Taylor, you can do what you want. You know, whoever's booking, you can do whatever you want. Nash, you know, he doesn't have the creative juices anymore because he's exhausted, and everyone's on drugs. Everyone's is getting drunk every night. I mean, it's just like as a frat house. It's like a traveling frat house that's putting on great television for a short period of time, but then there's diminishing returns in that type of thing.
The guys took a lot of drugs backstage and drank a lot. It was par for the course. So
Scott Hall flipped over like 7 rental cars in like '98, wow. and he was fine. And he was fine. I mean, he's like a mutant. You know, like he was flipping over Cadillacs. You know, he was getting arrested. He was in rehab, and it was just and then they made the storyline about him being drunk. You know, they really took that way too far. You know, Bischoff's whole thing was let's try to create the storyline from reality, and then he'd really take like Scott Hall is literally struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction. He's like, all right, let's make him a drunk on the air. You know, it just got so crazy.
Yeah, way over the top.
That Buff Bagwell gets paralyzed for real briefly, and then he comes back and he fakes he's paralyzed again. And it's like you're just I get the idea of kind of blending reality and fiction, but they went to the well too many times, and whatever filter they had in '96 and '97 that kind of stopped them from doing that, it all kind of went out the door in '98 and '99.
Agreed.
Well, as we're winding down, what was the biggest surprise to you digging in and doing all the research?
Okay, so the biggest surprise to me was that, so you guys know Neil Pruitt. He was one of the WCW producers. He did some of the early promos in WCW. The first NWO promo where the guys it's all black and white, and like they're cutting the promo with the 3 of them together. He was the producer on that. Excuse me. So I sat down with him a few years ago for the book in Atlanta, and we're talking for a few hours, and he was like, "You need to find the person who designed the NWO logo." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "No one has ever found the person who actually sat down at the computer and did the logo." I'm like, are you serious? He's like, "Yes." He's like, "Because it wasn't a WCW employee. It was someone that worked for Disney." And the whole thing is that in '96, the Olympics were happening in Atlanta, and WCW did not have access to any production trucks at their home in Atlanta because of the Olympics. So they were doing everything in '90s. They were doing everything in like June and July '96 in Orlando at Disney MGM Studios, and that was where the first Nitro was after Bash of the Beach. It was at Disney MGM Studios. So again, like I said before, they don't know this is coming. The marketing team, the producers, they don't know this big storyline is coming. And Hogan turns heel. Then they have literally like this. It's like hitting the jackpot, right? It's like having the lottery, but you don't have enough like hands to actually grab all the money. They're scrambling. What do we do? Well, we can't sell T-shirts without a logo. So they go like across like the lot at Disney MGM Studios, and there's a post-production studio there, post-production office, and it's called Disney Ideas, and it's like a subsidiary of Disney. And three producers go over there: Craig Leathers, Rob Wright, and Annette Yoder. They go over there, and they're trying to figure out, all right, who can we get to do a logo for this new thing that we have? Again, still not knowing that it was going to be as big as it was going to be. So they were like, all right, we have like 2 hours. We need to make a logo real fast. Let's get a logo together. So they go there, and they basically were told by like whoever was supervising that office, like, all right, we have one person who does designs, who does logos. Why don't you go see her? So they go and they stood behind her. It's a woman who was like 27 years old at the time, and they kind of dictated to her like what they wanted it to look like. Craig Leathers had he had gone to like Walgreens and CVS, and he was like he would be flipping through magazines trying to get an idea of like what he wanted the group to like feel like, what the logo should look like. He was looking at like skater magazines and heavy metal magazines and like, that type of thing. So the thing though is that no one who was there, those three producers, none of them remembered who this woman was. None of them.
Mm.
And I talked to Craig Leathers and Rob Wright, who were there. Annette Yother, I did not talk to for the book. But they both told me like, we don't know who she was. We kind of remember what she looked like. We don't know who she was. We don't know her name. And I told them, I'm like, I'm gonna try to find them. And I told Eric Bischoff, I'm gonna try to find this person. And they're like, there's no way. You're not gonna find her. It's lost the time. Like, how could you possibly find her? Well, I did. I freaking found her.
Oh, wow.
She's a real estate agent now in Winter Park, Florida, and she was the one who put the NWO logo on the screen for the first time. She designed it with her hands at a Mac computer in Orlando, Florida in 1996. And it's a crazy story of how I found her. I'm a reporter, right? That's what I do. I'm a journalist, and I track people down pretty well. But this was hard, guy. It took me a few months to find this woman because no one knew who the hell she was. They knew what she looked like. I had to find like an old Orlando Sentinel article that had the name of the general manager of this post-production studio. And that I saw that, all right, let me see if I can contact this woman first. So I went to her, the GM, and she was like, oh, I have no idea. It could be this person, could be this person. Why don't you contact this person? So I was like, all right. So then I contacted the other person, and they're like, well, it could be two people. Not really sure who it might have been, but it could be like one of these two people. So I found one of the two people, and it was not her. And I was like, man. And then I couldn't find the other one for a while. And I was like, why can't I find this woman? Where is she? I can't find her name on social media. I can't find it on, all the access that I have, as a journalist. And then finally, I was looking through like a Facebook page. And there's like a Facebook page of post-production people from Florida in the 90s. I don't even know how that exists, but it does. And someone posted this woman's name, but she got married. This was her maiden name. So she was nowhere under her maiden name anymore. She was only under her married name. That's why I couldn't find her. So then I was like, oh man, now I got her. So I did more research. I got her phone number and I texted her. And I'm like, I just completely cold text, right? After 20 something years of never hearing about this again. I texted her, hi, I'm Marc Raimondi. I'm writing a book. And this is a really random question, but does this mean anything to you? And I sent the photo of the logo, and I didn't hear back. 30 minutes pass, and I get ding. My phone goes off, and I look at my text, and she wrote back. And you know what she wrote? She's like, yes, I designed it. And I was like, oh my goodness, I found her. I can't believe it. And that stuff is all in the book. She never received a dime of royalties. She was just there working as an employee of Disney, and never saw a dime of the t-shirt money. One of the first things that she asked me, guys, even before like we even started the interview, she was like, how many t-shirts did they sell? Because she had no idea. And I had to break it to her that they probably sold hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars worth of t-shirts were sold, and she never saw a dime of it.
Heck, it's still one of their top 20 selling shirts.
It is. When Bischoff was back in WWE in like 2018, he told me that he looked at like the merchandise list, and he said that NWO was like 9th. It was still in the top 10, in 20 something years later. That's just remarkable. And this poor woman's a real estate agent in Winter Park, Florida, and she had no clue.
We were just at WWE World. You see NWO shirts everywhere. They had them in the Superstore. Wow, that is a crazy story. Wow.
Only in wrestling, guys. Only in wrestling.
Well, hey, let's let you pick a champion of the week here as we wrap it up.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right, this is Dan Housen, and you are watching Wrestling Spotlight TV. And if you're not, I don't know how you're seeing this video, but you're cursed.
Danhausen would have been a good NWO lackey. He's got
He would
the
have.
marketing. Yeah. So, Mark, who's your champion of the week? Who gets your championship belt?
What is the criteria? Is it just anybody?
Whoever you want in the world of wrestling. Maybe whoever represents the NWO best today.
That is really hard. I mean, wow. In wrestling right now,
Mm-hmm.
jeez, that is, you guys are really putting me on the spot here. You know what I'm gonna say? I'm gonna say Timeless Tony Storm. I'm gonna say Timeless Tony Storm is the champ this week. Some of the best character work I've ever seen from a women's wrestler, I think, ever in wrestling. I think that she's incredible, great worker. But the character stuff is just, she's so funny. You know, she's so compelling. She's must see TV for me. If she's on the screen, whatever I'm doing, I'm focusing on what Tony Storm is doing. So I think she's number one for this week for me.
That's a good one. And Sonny, who's your champion of the week?
Ricky Saints
Wrestling.
of NXT.
Yep.
Lost his title, but gave a humdinger of a match and took a bump on the back of a chair and hurt his throat. It looked real to me. He was vomiting some in the ring while wrestling. And no word has come back as to whether he lived or died, per se. Hopefully they'll get more into that this week, but Ricky Saints.
That's a good one. And I'm going to go with, off of AEW's Double or Nothing, Swerve Strickland, because he worked in both the Predator and his new Reebok shoes for the finish of the match. Put on his Whose House, Swerve's House, the answer, and that's what he had on when he did the Swerve Stomp to end the match for Anarchy in the arena. So a huge week of wrestling. But you can always look back, because so much of what you see today came from back then. The book's coming out June 24th. Go ahead and get it on all the pre-sales, wherever you get your book. How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. Say hello to the bad guys. The NWO for life. Marc Raimondi. Hours and hours of work. 4 years in the process. Man, I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm sure there's so many stories that'll dig up that, you just never thought of. Thanks so much for taking the time to step in the ring here, Mark. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed hanging out with you guys.
Excellent. And Sonny, we'll be back here next week. We'll break down and preview Money in the Bank. There's big shows coming, and then we are solidly on the road to All in Texas. We'll be there live for Wrestling Spotlight TV. So stay tuned. 24/7 Pro Wrestling. Our featured match this week on the channel comes from Pro Wrestling Ohio, and it involves the greatest TNT champion of all time, Big Brody Lee, taking on Kevin Nash from Shooters on the Flats in Cleveland, Ohio, back where I used to do morning drive radio from. So really neat to have Kevin Nash featured in a match on Wrestling Spotlight the same week as we're talking about Say Hello to the Bad Guys.
I love
Thanks a lot for joining us here, and we'll see you back in the ring. And go ahead and pre-order that book. June 24th becomes available. Thanks again, Mark.